Welcome to another episode of Africa Conversations. I've been looking forward to this one for quite some time. Zeina Maasri is a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, United Kingdom. Before taking up her post at Brighton, she was both an independent graphic designer and an academic at the American University of Beirut from 1999 to 2016 in Lebanon. She works across the fields of visual and cultural politics and design history with a particular attention on Lebanon and the Arab world. She's the author of Cosmopolitan Radicalism, the Visual Politics of Beirut's Global 60s, which came out from Cambridge University Press in 2020. Off the Wall, Political Posters of the Lebanese Civil War, which came out in 2009, and a curator of related traveling exhibitions and online archival resources, including the incredible signsofconflict.org, which we'll be talking about later. Zeina has also co-edited with many other people, including Karl Basil, Akram Zatari, and Walid Raad, Mapping Sitting on portraiture and photography. She's working on a new co-edited volume, Transnational Solidarity, Decentering the 60s, which is forthcoming with the Manchester University Press in 2022. Zeina, welcome to Africa Conversations.
Thank you, Mikey. Thanks a lot for inviting me to be part of this. It's a wonderful series, and I'm really honored and delighted to be part of it. And thanks for everyone for attending, joining us today.
It's our honor to have you on. So, you know, I was saying that I've been wanting to speak to you for some time because I live in Beirut. I grew up here, and posters and political posters, quite literally, obviously wallpaper the city, but also wallpaper our experience with this place. And so I'm curious, when did you realize that you wanted to understand these posters and these pieces of paper that decorate and sort of wallpaper the city that you called home?
Well, actually, it's something that I've, as a graphic designer, as someone who was also teaching at AUB in graphic design, I was also interested in the role of design or graphic design and visual culture to politics and the community. And this is where I realized there's nothing written about that, about our own community. And what I've been reading was all about international politics and political posters, but we are surrounded with this material in the everyday, but nothing's been written on it, or very little, or we know very little. So this is how I began my research, specifically on the Civil War posters. In particular, it was a way to look back at the history of the war, which is something that I've lived all my life, but yeah. Stepping back and looking at it as a scholar, as a researcher, is different.
Was the idea, Maya Mumni, who's on the call now, I remember when we interviewed her way back when, she said, graphic design is like the lowest art form on the art totem pole, right? So I wonder, were you interested in doing this research? Did the absence of scholarly research piss you off? Were you like, somebody has to take this seriously? Or were you like, how is nobody taking this seriously? I want to take this seriously.
Yeah, both, I guess. There's the absence of this material is there's a double problem. One, within the field of art history, which Maya might have mentioned. It's the applied art, it's visual culture. It's now, there's a whole new area of visual culture studies now that sort of looks at this sort of material and shifts the perspectives and changes the discipline of art history. But particularly in terms of politics, the visual is completely forgotten. And up until today, it's a fight for me in terms of trying to put on the agenda when we're talking about history, political histories, that the political history of how people imagine themselves, how they fought one another, is also as important. That's the everyday discourses that are shaping people's imagination. That's usually absent from, just when we talk about war history, it's the treaties that are built or decided on by key political leaders, and it's actually really boring and disconnected from
Yeah.
from how people live wars or participate in them or think about their futures in such conditions, or live in moments of revolution, basically, as well.
Yeah. So if you can just give us a sense of the structure of this project and how this book is also related to signs of conflict. Just to give people, and I highly encourage people who are listening today and listening in the future on YouTube and on podcasts, please go to Signs of Conflict. It's so interesting. It's a really rich resource. But tell us about the process and how these two projects are interrelated.
So the Signs of Conflict, I mean, it started with Signs of Conflict that ended up in a book, an exhibition, and the website, which you have, which is also an online exhibition and an archive of political posters. So the beginning was to collect this material. I started with a collection that was already at the American University of Beirut of political posters from the Civil War. This is where I discovered this material first, and then realized that it's incomplete. It doesn't cover the whole war or the whole period, or nor all the factions that were involved. So that's where collecting and interviewing and finding out and digging this material was part of a long process where I wasn't yet thinking that I would produce a book out of that, and it just developed. And then I realized that in fact one can write a history of the war through its wartime, through its posters. So this is where visual culture for me, these political posters were giving me insight about the war, about different ideological positions, but how they changed during the war, how people imagined who was the enemy and how they imagined them, the group or the collective sort of community in relation to that enemy, and how this changed, these images and iconographies and symbols changed throughout 15, 16 years of war, basically. So, we can, and in fact, I did write an alternative, a different history of the war through that sense of popular culture, through these images and posters that were part of the ongoing the struggle at the time. So.
I'm curious, when you published Off the Wall, when you were showing early manuscripts, or when you were showing, new posters that you sort of unearthed to family, friends who were maybe a little older than you, did they remember them? Oh, I remember that one. That was super memorable. That went viral, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because the time where I was beginning to dig into this material, I began this project in 2003. So it was also talking about the Civil War was still difficult with the older generation. So some would remember, but there was also a lot of curiosity. I was interviewing a lot of former partisans or former artists who worked on posters. They were always interested in the posters from the other side. Let us see the other side. They don't know because Beirut was divided, so they wouldn't know. So that was interesting. But for me, what was so exciting is that to see the younger generation who had the students I was teaching at the time in Beirut, because I actually taught an elective course called Signs of Conflict, which was based on this material before I even published. So the first thing was to begin to share with students, discuss this material, build these chronologies. And I think their feedback was so important to think, well, we need to do more about this. And the exhibition and then the website was one way to actually archive and put that into public memory and make it accessible.
Yeah.
So up until today, I think so many of the generations don't know, that have not lived the war or were born late in the war, don't know what has happened. They only know what they've inherited from their own parents. So yeah. One way is to access this. It's important to access this memory, but to access it differently. One of my go on.
No, it's interesting because what I feel you're doing with the new project, Cosmopolitan Radicalism, is actually that process. where Off the Wall is this study of what happens 1975 onwards, and taking a look at that visual language and that vocabulary and those ideologies. And then it's almost like you said, wait, how did we start? How did we actually get to 1975? Does that make sense? Am I right about that?
Absolutely, yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So maybe we can start there. Maybe we can start about why this project started.
I think that what you said, how did we get here in terms of 1975, but how did we get here in terms of today is why I'm interested in history. Or how I moved from being a graphic designer to become more of a historian. So yes, this is the cosmopolitan radicalism actually developed from work that I've been doing on Off the Wall or on Signs of Conflict, where I was interested in the I began to discover material then that did not fit into the Off the Wall, things that like from books to pamphlets to material that were not strictly posters and were not strictly engaged in the war, and a lot of material that was done by artists and designers who were not Lebanese, so Egyptian, Iraqi, Syrian, who were just passing through Lebanon. And I wanted to discover what brought them there. So someone like Helmi Touni, who lived in Beirut from 73 to 83, why was he there? So, and why was he involved? What was he involved with? So that began a curiosity in the earlier pre-war period, which we know as a myth today as the golden age of Beirut. But if we dig a bit deeper, we realize it's actually a very anxious time. And it's a time where, I mean, of glamour, but it's a time of anxieties, of antagonism, of something boiling, of desires for change that were very important, of revolutionary times, basically, that were connected globally. So this is the pre-history, as you mentioned, to the war.
You're concerned. The book is concerned with what you call the long 60s, and you bookend it between 1958 and 1975. For those on the call, why is 1958 an important moment in the making of Beirut and the making of the country and the nation?
Well, 58 was first a revolt, an armed revolt against the ruling regime at that time, which was under the presidency of Camille Chamoun. It was an important revolutionary moment in the Arab world as well, in Iraq, but also it was a moment just followed after 1956 Suez War, the rise of Abdel Nasser. 58 was also the union between Egypt and Syria. So Lebanon was just boiling. And it was a moment of severe economic inequality. And tensions that sort of bursted into that revolt in 58 that eventually got silenced by a major intervention by the US in terms of the military intervention of the US, the famous landing of the US Marines in Beirut, Khelde in 1958, in the summer of 1958. So that's an important moment. In terms of regional and local politics.
Yeah, those of you who can see the screen, this photo depicts, I love this photo. This photo depicts that moment, the US Marines coming up the street that I'm on right now. There's about 10, 15 meters away from my current house. But okay, so that anxiety and that neurosis is, you brilliantly sort of help illustrate that neurosis and that anxiety of that period. Almost like there are these three images of Beirut as a place that I feel like you're trying to argue exists. One, Beirut as this sort of tourism capital, this Mediterranean city on the sea. Then there is another one, which is this center for publishing. And then there's another one that you talk about as the Arab Hanoi. Can you give just like a brief description of what each of those images is, and how they were even sort of promoted visually. And I'm going to jump around some images while you talk, and hopefully they can match.
The slide that you just skipped a bit quickly, the one before about the nodal city, actually frames a bit those three images. It's just to think that the long 60s are a time of both the Cold War globally, and Beirut became a node in the Cold War. Just thinking of the 1958 intervention, this was the first US intervention supposedly to safeguard Lebanon from communist threat. That was the pretext, and it was the first in the region, in fact, of the US intervention, military intervention in the region. So in that's important globally, but also importantly, we're talking about a moment of anti-colonial, the rise of anti-colonialism in the region and globally across the global south. So that's where also Beirut becomes a nodal city in the global 60s. Now, the three areas in the next slide that I'm interested in this book are how the visual culture of Beirut actually shapes Beirut is important in shaping Beirut becoming a nodal city in these three areas, basically in tourism, and that's international tourism on the Mediterranean rising globally after World War II, and Beirut was trying to be on the map of that tourism. So, and this is important within the history of Lebanon, because we start seeing a shift in the image of Lebanon's touristic imagination from that of the mountain as a summering, as a space of a summer resort in the Arab East, but to becoming a Mediterranean space of leisure in the 60s. So that's one area I'm interested in that shaped Beirut's nodal configuration, but also the second is the Beirut becoming a very important space for a nodal city in terms of publishing within the Arab world, from magazines to cultural journals and magazines to also books. And this is where we start seeing, this is where I begin to understand why someone like Helmi Touni came to Beirut in the 70s, why other artists were also coming to Beirut around that time. So there's also an intersection between art and publishing, where Beirut becomes a very important hub and a node of connections, of transnational connections. And that also is linked politically both to the Cold War and to anti-colonialism, but also to Beirut being a space of leisure. So for instance, such as the Baalbek Festival here. And so that combines some of these two areas, like tourism and leisure, but also publishing and art and publishing. So these nodes sort of interconnect and intersect sometimes. And the third, the Arab Hanoi. And I was particularly interested in how the long 60s is a period of transformation from Beirut being the Paris of the East in terms of basically that connection to that cosmopolitan connection to Europe, to the former colonial power, to a certain imagination of Beirut as a space of leisure and as a liberal space of leisure. But also how that gets to be politicized by the end of the 60s and after 67, after the major Arab Israeli war and the rise of the Palestinian resistance, specifically from Lebanon from the 1970 onwards, how that gets to be transformed into a new imagination of Beirut that actually stretches across the global south, and where Beirut becomes named or is dubbed the Arab Hanoi. So the Arab Hanoi, in the sense that is similar to, it's a connection to Vietnam, and the idea that how North Vietnam or Hanoi played the role of that sort of bridgehead for the liberation of South Vietnam. So Lebanon, in that sense, is imagined as a
Is that, just to cut you off for a second, is that a Western moniker or is that a local moniker?
It's a local one. Yeah, it's a local one. It's mostly by the Palestinian resistance. And this is something I build on the work of Fawaz Trabulsi, the historian who has written about Beirut as the Arab Hanoi and lived it as such, as a former activist. So I was interested in how then the infrastructure that was there for tourism, leisure, and for art and publishing gets to be reshaped, transformed, and politicized and radicalized within a revolutionary period of the late 1960s and in connection to the Palestinian resistance, but how that imagination actually sort of how people begin to imagine themselves in that revolutionary process in connection to a global transformation of the radical 60s of, Latin America. I mean, we're talking about sort of Cuba after in the late 60s, the tricontinental, the sort of solidarities that were taking shape across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So this was, and Beirut also played a nodal role as a city of publishing, but also as a space of political resistance through the Palestinian, as an anti-imperialist site of resistance globally through the Palestinian struggle.
So just to get a sense about this for a second. So there are these three nodes, right? Mm-hmm. And each node is part of these different networks. Are these competing networks, or are they just confusing networks? Are they competing images, or are they confusing images?
That's a very good question. First of all, I relate them, or I refer to them as circuits, and these are circuits in which, rather than networks, because networks is about connections between different individuals within a sort of structure. But I'm looking at circuits in which certain images traveled and people also traveled with these images, or the producers of the image makers, designers, and these images in terms of print, basically. So what I also refer to as printscapes. Now, these are different circuits that sometimes in how I analyzed it and my observations, they intersect, and sometimes they converge, and sometimes they completely diverge and get into tension with one another. But that changes throughout the long 60s. And therefore, that's also why it's important to look at the 60s, not just as a decade, but at something that was forming across a longer period, as specifically in terms of the major changes that were taking shape. But the tensions are sometimes there and sometimes not. And certain things begin to completely change after 1967. So that's important, where some of the same artists who were involved with, for instance, some of the more liberal projects, or projects that were, in fact, some of it was unknowingly funded by the CIA. That's, for instance, the magazine Hiwar. Some of the people who actually contributed to Hiwar, and it was a very liberal art and cultural magazine, which was actually, but also a brilliant one. It would become more politicized after 1967, and would be doing publications in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, would be doing much more radical publishing projects, and building on some of the aesthetic, experimentations that they were doing in a magazine such as Hiwar, but taking it to a political end. Someone like Dia al-Azzawi, he didn't work with Hiwar in particular, but I'm saying some of his earlier work would become more politicized later, but also Kamal Boulata, the Palestinian artist.
Yeah. So like using Boulata as an example, let's use like Boulata and Sehnaoui as two examples. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like they thought of each other as creating a image of Lebanon that is contrary to each other? Image of Beirut as contrary to each other, maybe, is not Lebanon?
I don't think they imagined it as contrary necessarily, but they were also operating, perhaps that you took the very, very different.
Exactly.
I think they were not in the same circle. Let's put it this way. And Sehnaoui at that time was heading the art department of the National Council of Tourism in Lebanon, in which she produced all the identity of the, I mean, the logo that we, for those who are Lebanese, the logo of Lebanon that we still see, that is used by the Ministry of Tourism, is designed by Mona Sehnaoui, Mona Basili Sehnaoui, at that time. So there, I think they were. There was a tension, definitely, in the sort of trying what the council was trying to do, not necessarily just Sehnaoui, but here it's important to understand how the National Council was trying also very much to counter an image of Beirut becoming an Arab Hanoi. Let's not forget, in 1968, Israel bombed the Beirut airport and destroyed 13 Middle East passenger planes at that time. And this was something very important, and in terms of sort of challenging an international image that the council was really striving to present as, you know, this is we're this wonderful Mediterranean sunny land. Please come here. There's nothing going on. There's no conflict. There's no politics. So there is a tension in terms of competing imagery.
There's a fourth image that that I was curious to pick your brain about. There's the image of Beirut as the Switzerland of the Middle East, which is to say the finance hub, the place where you can stash your money and get good returns. And because you brought up Middle East Airlines, which was at the time owned by Yusuf Beidas, who has his own sort of complicated story, I'm curious if that also is part of if that played a part of the sort of visual language.
Mikey, which one you're referring to as the Switzerland of the East? Do you have it here? Not as a, okay.
I mean,
no, because
there
is a specific image in the book that I analyze in the first chapter where I talk about the roots of the idea of Lebanon being, I mean, being the Switzerland of the East is actually a touristic model. It wasn't a banking model.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was developed by Lebanese nationalists in the early in the 20s as an idea, and then it was put into practice through policies. The first chapter looks into the history of how Lebanon was first conceived touristically, just as it was being formed in 1920. Basically, this is the Lebanon in. Thinking now of the centenary, the modern formation of Lebanon is built on the idea that it is the Switzerland of the East, economically and nationally.
Yeah, I always thought it was the finance secrecy stuff. Interesting.
It's later on, and it's something I end with. So it's when Beirut begins to rise. So the CNTL, the Council for National Tourism, later in the 60s begins to shift the imagination or the touristic image of Lebanon from the mountain, from the idea of the Switzerland of the East as a touristic escape and space in the East, in the Arab East, to a Mediterranean tourism. This image that that tourism, that Mediterranean tourism is something that's born out of the 60s and is a desire to shift that from the mountain to a cosmopolitan, Mediterranean hub. And at that time, this is where that we don't lose the whole sight of that statement of Lebanon being the Switzerland of the East. It just gets new meanings, and that gets to be associated with banking secrecy, with also later on in the war with the issue of neutrality. Or with also more polemically, I mean, more problematic is with the cantonization, with the division. So there's other meanings that arise with that metaphor of Lebanon being the Switzerland of the East. But initially, it was a touristic model. This is, you can see that in the poster in the bottom, just underneath where Lebanon مصيف البلاد العربية, and that's the idea of that initial idea of Lebanon's touristic promise is mainly the mountains, and this is done in the 50s by like an agency, a Lebanese agency that was responsible for that, a state agency, the General Commission for Tourism and summer vacationing or summering.
So I want to switch gears for a second. At first glance, one may think that most of the stuff that being printed is geared towards adults, but you spend a good amount of your time talking about children's books. Why and how these are illustrated by the very same artists, many of the same artists. So give us a little bit of a primer into why the medium of children's books is meaningful.
Well, a children's book specifically with Dar al-Fata al-Arabi, which is not this slide, it's these ones. Dar al-Fata al-Arabi is the first Arabic publishing project that is dedicated for children, that came out in 1974 in Beirut, and that was associated initially with the PLO, but had some political independence. But it's born out specifically of Beirut becoming the Arab Hanoi. And this is what I mean, that it's sort of is linked to the infrastructure of printing and arts and publishing that was already there, but that gets to be politicized for a different project. So the Dar al-Fata was a revolutionary project for children to aim to change, to write in Arabic, to address children in Arabic, and to have both the aesthetics and the knowledge production localized. And in that sense, we can say it's to decolonize Arabic literature, both in terms of the aesthetics, but also in terms of the children's affect and imagination. So the idea of building the future, a decolonized future, was to start with children, because they are the future. So it was a revolutionary idea, and those who participated, from the intellectuals who were part of the editorial board to the authors who wrote wrote or illustrated these books, and this is Helmi Touni. It was an amazing project of solidarity, but also experimentation, of wanting to really think how do we present something, how do we build a new society, a new future.
Unveiled, right? Unveiled intentions, very, very clear, transparent intentions. This is what this is about.
Sorry, yeah.
I'm saying the nature of the publishing house had transparent intentions. They weren't trying to slide in the messaging. It was very transparent.
Yeah, and not all of it was directly political. So some of it had, so there was a clear, very studied pedagogy of the different sections. But so some of them were just about, freedom, introducing concepts such as freedom, introducing like Ghurab bil-Alwan is about diversity. There's also a series of science books for children. So it actually introduces children to the history of science in the Arab world, which none of us actually, if we studied in Lebanon, knew about, unless or even in UNRWA, education for children in Palestinian camps that were not exposed to. So here we see Kamal Boulata again, Muhyiddin al-Labad, Nawal Haboud. That it was a radical revolutionary project of the late 60s. And it's also interesting what you say is just this, not hiding anything. How do you present, one can ask, how do you present these difficult concepts, specifically if some of it is political, or the one that's about the previous one by Helmi Touni about the camps, the bullets in the camps. Previous one, yes, this one, Samt wal Mukhayyam. And one needs to really ask. I mean, this is the question that some of the intellectuals were writing about. How do you want to write how do you present literature to children who are living in very difficult conditions, who are living in exile, don't know where their homeland, or some whose brothers have joined, for instance, the resistance, who constantly are under bombardment, and can you just really bring, get them to read these very bourgeois books that were there, also translated from French or English, Ladybird kind of books about, how to have very good mannered dinner table conversations. It's just, these were revolutionary times. So we need to think about the literature and about, effective dimensions of children in living these conditions.
Yeah. This is like the argument for hip hop in the 70s coming out of the Bronx. Which is to say, like, of course we were talking about violence and drugs and poverty. Okay, I have another question for you. Going back to this idea, I'm going to pull up this term. You're specifically talking about Beirut, right? Beirut as a node, a nodal city. Not Lebanon, although it's not like you're ignoring the nature of the nation and the country. But you introduced this term translocal. What does that mean in the context of your book? And what does it mean in the context of all these artists coming from all these different places and then publishing across these circuits, these different sort of overlapping circuits?
Yeah, it's basically that when I began looking at this material, and then that led me to all these artists who were coming in and out, and all these the publications themselves traveling. So I was interested in how do we write an art or design history that's not always framed by the nation? So if we were to frame, like most of the art histories that were written about Lebanon, then you're looking at what is Lebanese and what is, and also filtering in terms of Lebanese artists. And I think that's very problematic because it actually leaves out all sorts of other, non-Lebanese citizens, and that's also a struggle, we know in Lebanon, leaves out a lot of work leaves out work done by immigrants, migration, all of that. It just is ruled out. And I think once we undo that sense of the national framework, then we are able to see a much richer space of interaction, Beirut cities being spaces of encounter, of travel, of migration, and then the production is broader. And so then it's important there's the other dimension is also to think about that we shouldn't be falling into the trap. It's either local design or global. There's something that is in between, right? And that's something that is moving. And the global and the local are not necessarily in contradiction with one another, and they're actually in conversation with one another. So even if I'm talking about an image of Beirut as a Mediterranean hub, that might look like Capri or might look like Greece, but it's also being reclaimed locally. So there's something that's globally interconnected, but also is understood and has meanings that have local relevance. Politically, the way I try to analyze, for instance, translocal visuality of the Mediterranean images is a reclamation of Beirut or that Mediterranean scape as a Phoenician ancestry, right? And we also read that politically in all of the tourism pamphlets of around that time. So this is what I mean by the translocal. There's something that's both local and globally framed at the same time. The same thing for the revolutionary, the idea of what we know locally in the Arab world as the Fida'i, the young Palestinian resistance with the gun, symbolic. It's a very symbolic representation with the kufiye. But this was connected to a similar imagery and iconography or symbolism across the global South and anti-colonial movements. That's the idea of the freedom fighter. And you see a very similar symbolism that's actually traveling across these locations, from the idea from the figure of Che Guevara as the heroic guerrilla to Vietnam and to Algeria, and then there's again another, as much as we want to think of the Fidei as a very local, symbol, it's actually very translocal because it's connected to all the anti-colonial struggles, and which were mostly armed at that time. So that's what I try to analyze.
I'm going to ask you to sort of comment on where we are today, and in two ways. The first is a technological challenge. The walls where these images are showing up today aren't physical. They're digital spaces. So I'm curious how you're capturing those and how your colleagues are trying to capture them and try to understand them. That's the first question. The second question is, I'm curious about, it seems as though in the Arab world, it will get harder and harder for our bodies to move from locality to locality, that borders are closing more and more. But information seems to move maybe easier than it did in 1958. And so I'm curious how that may also change our visual language, and if we can still have this sort of translocality going forward.
Yeah, good questions, Mikey. I think in terms of the contemporary, it's not something I work on a lot, but participate more. But it's I would say that there's always the connection between the digital space of media, the movement of images in media, electronic spaces, but the physical spaces in which people congregate. And just thinking about the last decade of Arab revolutions, and recently also in Lebanon, you'd actually start. It's the spaces. The physical space of the public space of meeting is as important. This is where you start seeing graffiti and other forms of tagging, and that's an expression of the politics, a visual expression of the politics of the day that gets to travel not through print as in the 60s, but through digital media platforms and connect people. So there's always that in between intermediality, if one wants to specifically refer to it. I think that in terms of the borders closing, yes, I think it still is that the images travel faster today through these media than we are able to travel within the space of the Arab world. It's just so difficult. It's shrinking. Our spaces are shrinking incredibly, but there's still possibilities through these digital media where you start seeing some hopes of interconnections and solidarities that actually, where people are able, I think what was so remarkable during the revolution now almost 2 years ago, the connection between what was going on in Iraq and what was going on in the streets of Lebanon, and that these connections were happening and feeding off each other, sometimes through some social media platforms. You could see that there's a recognition, there's an identification in the struggle, in people's one another's struggles. There's also identification with also the recent summer, for instance, of the more recent uprising, the Palestinian uprising, which was also remarkable in its connection to Black Lives Matter and people do keep on rising against the different forms of oppression, and they find new media to do so, to connect to one another. So despite the very difficult borders, I mean, just imagine the most difficult borders to cross is in Palestine, right? Palestine and Israel and under occupation, and the fragmentation that Palestinians live, but still the connections were made possible recently, defying all of these borders. Now, we would love to cross these physically, materially, not just in image form. Yeah. Hopefully we will someday, but yeah.
Inshallah. Okay, I'm going to do 4 really rapid questions, and then we have 2 questions in the chat, and I suspect we'll have some more. So what are you reading or watching right now?
Watching. Don't look up. Just watched.
Don't look up. Yeah, on Netflix.
And reading. Yeah, it's just you can pass on. It's just not
okay.
on my.
We'll keep going.
Yeah.
Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
The governor of Lebanon's central bank. Yes.
Riyad Salameh.
Exactly. Yes, and put him in jail. Get access to all the data that we need, basically, that people need to reclaim what's been stolen from them in Lebanon. Yeah.
What do people most misunderstand about your work?
I think we covered that in the beginning, is that the visual doesn't have to do, a visual culture history is not an art history or not a political history. It's specifically not recognizing that it's an important access to read politics, cultural politics.
Okay. And then outside of your profession, whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
Outside of my direct profession, I mean, at the moment, I'm thinking just in terms of academics, and I'm very inspired by academics who are able to be both academics and public intellectuals and activists at the same time. And I think, that's an ideal. That's always admirable and for me very inspiring.
Yeah, heart, body, and mind. Okay. All right, we have two questions in the chat so far. The first one comes from Rania. Rania, if you want to unmute yourself and if you'd like to put on your camera, you're more than welcome to.
Hello, Rania.
Hi.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. So I just was wondering, in terms of the graphics, how reflective are they from your understanding of the actual society on the ground at that time, like from the three different nodes, and how much of it is more a reflection or like a mirroring of external expectations or wants of Lebanon?
I mean, it's both. I mean, we need to think of. I try to think of these images or these visual culture as both an expression of a society within a certain context and historical conditions, but also in itself an agent in bringing particular changes or presenting possible avenues or promises or aspirations that one wants or desires for something that could change. So I think it's something. It's both a player and an expression of the time.
Great.
But do you think one is more dominant than another?
I wouldn't generalize. I think it would be particular to the social history of a very particular images, and we can see then what's more dominant. But I think generally that's how I historically investigate images, the role of images in society.
Great. Nasser, you're up next.
Hi.
Hi, Nasser.
Hi, Nasser.
Hi. Sorry, I'm not going to put on my camera. I haven't done my makeup yet today.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Zeina. This was very rich. And my question is actually very ill-formed the way I wrote it. But excluding the current moment, which I know nothing about, and that image that was on the screen is very much representative of the meltdown of the last couple of years. But looking at the recovery after the Civil War, it seemed to me that there was an overlap, if you want, between the images that you so aptly analyzed in terms of presenting Lebanon as a cosmopolitan center in a backward region that people can come to and enjoy it as the Paris of the East, and that Hanoi of the Arabs. And I felt, at least looking at the architecture, but this is why I would like to hear your opinion about the rest of the visual world, that the attempt of the Hariri mentality and the Hariri period was to actually bring the two together in an attempt at creating a new image of Beirut that can no longer be that Europeanized cosmopolitan center of the 1920s, 30s, 40s under the French mandate. But at the same time, there is no desire to make it the revolutionary center for all the refugees from the revolutionary regimes in the Arab world, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and so on. I mean, Helmi Touni is practically a political refugee in Beirut at the time. He was also a communist. So my question is that, do you see such overlap in the graphic language of the 90s and the early 2000s between these two ultimately ideological images of a European Beirut and an Arab Beirut?
Well, I think what I think is the Hariri project was trying to do was to reclaim that idea of the golden age, the myth of a golden age of Beirut, the Paris of the East, but to reframe it within an Arab and neoliberal actually context. So it's, and not at all, not the liberal framework in which it was developing in the early 60s, and not the revolutionary one in the late 60s, but in a new sort of commercialized, sold myth, and that's mainly the work that happens in Solidaire, basically. And I think you know more than I do about the architecture of that type of that place, and the way that it sort of became a tourist hub that specifically catered for the Gulf, and that sort of banking the idea of Beirut becoming also the space where the monies of the Gulf riches could actually come in. And I think that's the central project. But I think it's also that the Arab world transformed at that time. So when we're talking about the 1990s, so the regimes surrounding regimes were no longer those which were in 1958 or early 60s, and they have failed also to deliver their post-colonial sort of promises of restitution of dignity, of some sort of forms of rebuilding a new social order. So I think there is a moment where by the 90s that project that post-colonial project has failed within the region. So I think that it just builds on a pastiche of the past, and that's very much the postmodern architecture that was also going on at that time. It's a pastiche of previous nostalgia, either for a regional framework, an Arab identity, but also for a pastiche of a golden age. That I think Solidaire combines both. if I'm I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, I agree. But that also explains why you want to shadow Riyad Salami.
Yeah. Don't tell him.
He's not on our mailing list, don't worry. Thanks, Nasser.
Thank you.
We have one real, Lily, hopefully we can get in your question really quickly.
Yeah. Nice. Super excited. This is phenomenal. I've missed you so much. Zeina has been for me, everyone. So I just want to credit is due. I have one question, and I'm really, really keen as someone who works in development right now, and I'm really keen on the idea of imagination. I feel crisis makes space, destruction makes space for imagination, for creation. I feel right now, I know you don't do contemporary, but what about the megaphone, the stuff that's happening locally, the visual culture there? What's the imagination happening there, and the trends that are basically influencing the current imagination that will be essential for us to transform or rise or fall, whatever?
I missed you too, Lilian. Megaphone is amazing. I don't work on the contemporary just because I want to be able to participate somehow. Maybe I'm not a social scientist. I've never been able to perhaps just disconnect and look at contemporary society very, without just being very passionately involved. So I do my reflections, but it's not been, and I think there's a new generation of people doing amazing work, and they can do that research and build. I do the historical, and we can work together and collaborate. So it's your work, Lilian. But I think you're right about the imagination, and about these are revolutionary times, just like they were in the late 60s as well. And it pushes people to work together collectively, do things differently, and actually work with very little means at their disposal, because it's about their livelihood. It's something that, it's not just survival. It's just about wanting to do something and being active and it mobilizes. So the imagination is about hope, right? It's about possibly imagining something different. It's about being, and I think creative practices from art, visual arts, to music, to dance, to just all these forms of aesthetic practices are activated, particularly in these moments. Because one needs hope, and they inspire hope. Yeah.
Zeina, thanks so much. I really, really appreciate you taking the time for sharing your work with us. This was hugely enriching. So thanks so much. Thank
you so much, Mikey. That's really great. And I hope we can meet in person sometimes, all of you.
Yeah.
All of those who are there. Thank you.
Yeah. Inshallah. Everyone, enjoy your day or night wherever you are. This will come out on the podcast in a few days and up on YouTube as well. So once it comes out, if you enjoyed it, share it with your friends, and also go to Signs of Conflict. The website's up on the screen.